Welcome everybody to the opening of Liberty and Justice. My name is Stephen Mays. I'm the Managing Director of 7 Photo. This is our gallery. Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros, who died a little over a year ago in Libya, were particular friends of ours, both personally and professionally. But I think it's important to note that they were 2 of over 60 journalists who died in the course of covering world events in 2011. And it's a situation which is only getting worse. And one of the extraordinary things, or one of the particular things about photography is, of course, that it is very up close. And that both speaks to the bravery, courage, and tenacity of the photographers themselves, who very often are as close to the subjects as you are to these pictures here. And it also, of course, brings that intimacy to us as viewers, which is also an incredible privilege. And so what we have here on the walls, and of course in the quarterly review, is a document, but also a moment for reflection. So on that, I would like to pass you over.
Let me introduce this panel. It's important for you to have an idea of their experience because it really affects this conversation that we're going to have about liberty, justice, and photojournalism. Martha Raddatz, to my left, TV journalist and author. She covered the Pentagon for many years for NPR. She then went to ABC News, covered the State Department, traveled the world with Colin Powell. She then went to the White House for George W. Bush's second term and is now senior foreign affairs concert maker correspondent for ABC News. She made 21 visits to Iraq during that conflict and has made literally dozens of trips to Afghanistan and Pakistan, many more than any other broadcast journalist. There was a New York Times magazine profile of her talking about not only her coverage, calling it not only accurate and complete, but powerfully human, which gives her a perspective on the human aspects of being a correspondent these days. She's earned all of the prestigious broadcast journalism awards, including National News and Documentary Emmy and the Peabody Award. But she's also an author, a New York Times bestseller. The Long Road Home told the story of that 2-day conflict in Sadr City in Baghdad that changed the nature of America's involvement in the war in Iraq. So this is Martha Raddatz. John Moore, to her left, senior photographer for Getty. He has photographed more than 70 countries. He has spent a lot of the last decade in Iraq and Afghanistan, and more recently the uprisings in Libya and Egypt, Bahrain, and the famine in Somalia. His work had been recognized with a Pulitzer, the Overseas Press Club's Robert Capa Gold Medal, top awards from World Press Photo, National Press Photographers Association, Pictures of the Year International, etc. And so, etc. and etc. This is John Moore. Philip Ghraib, staff writer for The New Yorker for the last 15 years, traveled extensively in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the United States, covering conflicts and political and human events. 3 of his stories were finalists for the National Magazine Award, received citations for excellence from Overseas Press Club, covered the early years of the Iraq War. He is also a photojournalist, and for several years succeeded George Plimpton as editor of the Paris Review. His 3 books have earned nearly every major book award, and one of the books, entitled "We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families," unquote, was included in the Guardian's, the former Manchester Guardian's, list of 100 greatest nonfiction books of the last 2,500 years. And of course, Ben Spatz, and this is his baby. He created this. Ben, start us off, would you? How did this come about? What came into your head and or heart that you created this?
Yeah, this was really born from reflection from this tragedy. And after April 20, it was a shattering moment for me and so many of us here, and really began thinking about what these two friends meant, what their work was all about, and what the best, most powerfully enduring photojournalism was about. And I felt that it really was touching on more than just any single conflict or any single issue. It really was able to touch on something much more fundamental about the human condition at its best. And just so happened that at that time last April, my father was visiting me in Washington, D.C., and while I'm shuttling back and forth to funerals, we were having long conversations about how to think about these men and what they did. And we hit on the idea of liberty and justice. I also should say, for the audience's sake, that my father is the editor of Alaska Quarterly Review, and he's on Skype, which is why we have the... But we were trying to really understand how these men wanted to engage the world, and really quickly jumped into the idea that they were the most engaged men around. They were so interested in trying to unlock these hard problems and communicate visually about them. We tried to think of a way to come up with a proactive tribute, and that's what we're seeing here, is a proactive tribute that takes all of these voices around the themes of liberty and justice and tries to think about hearing all of the different voices and looking at the varied ways that people understand those themes, and hopefully drive a conversation about these issues that Tim and Chris were engaged in and led on often.
Martha, when you first looked at this, you've only had the actual AQR for a few days.
Yep.
You opened up, you looked at it, you started reading and looking. What'd you see?
Well, when I first looked at it, I sort of looked at it quickly, and today, in my 3-hour train ride up from Washington, D.C., I really concentrated on it. And to me, the combination, and I guess we sort of have a combination up here of the writing about the photographs and the photographs themselves. And there were a few words that stood out to me. Some of the photos make you uncomfortable. And I thought that they don't make you so uncomfortable that you want to turn away. And to me, that's when a photograph is so incredible, is that you're uncomfortable, particularly about a conflict. You're uncomfortable, but you're not uncomfortable enough that you would ever turn away from that photograph. I was also struck by the depth and the breadth of the photos, and everyone's definition of liberty and justice, and how photojournalists look at this. And I also, I know John, I know his image, I know other people's images, and some of those images were familiar. And as a broadcast journalist who deals with video every day, we more and more put still photographs on the air because they're so powerful. You cannot beat a still photograph, because I'm thinking of a little girl from Sierra Leone and holding up the thumb by the Statue of Liberty. That would have been lost in video, right? It would have been completely lost in video, but to stop that moment and to make you think in ways you don't think in any other medium is just extraordinary to me.
John, tell us about Mary Mchugh, which is, your contribution here today, but tell us that story, would you?
Mary Mchugh, I met one day on Memorial Day weekend back in 2007. I had visited Arlington National Cemetery. I had not lived in the U.S. for many years. I came back that summer for the birth of my first child. And I decided to visit Arlington National Cemetery because I had met a few people who were buried there, and thought I owed it a little bit of my time, and so I went to the cemetery that day, and was walking through, and I met Mary. She was sort of kneeling next to a tomb, to a marble stone, and I waited for a moment where I could speak with her. Another one of the people there at the grave, at Section 60 cemetery, went up and talked to her, so there was a break and I could go talk to her. And I told her who I was and what I was doing and where I'd worked, some of the same places. As it turned out that her fiance, Jimmy Regan, who had been a Special Forces soldier, had worked in Iraq. And he had died in a roadside bomb a few months before. And this was her first time back to the cemetery since that happened. And so we exchanged a few words. I told her I was going to shoot a few pictures if it was okay. I wandered off through the cemetery and came back a few minutes later, and she was stretched out on the ground, on the grass next to the grave, whispering to the stone. And I made a few pictures and moved on. And that was one of the only things I've actually photographed in the U.S. For many years. I moved back here a couple years ago, and it's still a memory that stays with me. Getting to know people like that, both in and outside the U.S.
Philip, you're both a writer and a photojournalist. When you go to what Martha talked about, the combination of narrative and photograph, how do you approach all this?
Well, I have to correct you. I'm not a photojournalist.
We'll take that out of your resume.
Yeah, it's not in there. I've published, when I was at the Paris Review, I published photographs, so that might be the confusion. But I've always admired, I've always looked at, long before I became a journalist, I was already looking at photojournalism as well as, probably before I started reading written journalism of any quality, or anything other than just the daily paper. Some of that's pretty high quality. I think I also had a bit of this reaction when I looked at this exhibit in the magazine in its entirety. I was thinking a lot about, and I've thought a lot about this over the years, which is captions, the relationship between pictures and captions, the relationship between pictures and explanations of pictures, and also working with and knowing and being friends with photographers, and the kind of tension that photographers have about this, the desire to take a picture that doesn't require any words, and then the desire also to explain it. And so you have just even the title of this whole thing, Liberty and Justice, and I have to admit that I'm always wary of these gigantic, huge terms like that, and I look at that and I say, liberty and justice, like how on earth can photograph a really particular photograph? One of the things that I love most about photographs and photojournalism, in other words, using photographs for a specific kind of like documentary journalism, is that they're, in a sense, allowed but also able to just pack much more of an unapologetic emotional wallop than most of us do in any given sentence or any given paragraph. We kind of do it more quietly. We do it a little bit more cagily. We try to let you have the emotion or to hold back. We don't want you to feel manipulated, whereas a photograph doesn't worry about that most of the time. And sometimes to a fault, obviously. Photographs can kind of be sensational almost inevitably very, very fast because they create sensation. That's their power. And I think that when you start to get it, but then you look at it, and it's particularly when you're looking at images of conflicts, of violence, of hardship, that I often do want a caption, an explanation, an account. It's not that the picture needs it to be a great or a powerful or a strong picture, but that if I'm going to have an emotion about a dead person lying somewhere, let's say, the way I put it, to put it really simply, if I'm going to look at a picture of a dead body at the gates of Auschwitz and be told that it's like the day after liberation in 1945, I want to know if I'm looking at an SS guard or at a survivor before I have an emotion. I want to know what emotion I'm having. I want to know what that's up. It's not the same. But a photograph creates a sameness that almost inevitably a caption dispels or complicates. And so what's really interesting in these is that they're not specifically explanatory captions in that way, but they're often an attempt by the photographer to sort of reckon with what they thought they were looking at and what they realized they were looking at after they took the picture. There's the difference between taking the picture and then looking at the picture later and having to account for it. And I think that's interesting. And I think, to me, I knew Tim Hetherington's work and I knew Chris Hondras' work, but I was much more aware of Tim's work as a kind of body of work as opposed to specific images that I was aware of, and I think that's partly because of how Tim worked. And he had come to me at the Paris Review with Long Story Bit by Bit. That's a book. He's an image maker who can make pictures that do not require captions. They are very, very powerful by themselves. They capture visually an enormous amount of the drama and the pageantry of the thing. They show the way the thing looks to itself to some extent. And at the same time, he has a journalistic instinct for explaining. And these kind of texts that sit beside them, they only enlarge what you're looking at. But they don't then make the photographs less interesting when you see them by themselves, you know? And that's a really complicated and interesting thing that I think requires this strange form that we don't always see anymore, which is the photo essay. And this is something I'm endlessly perplexed by, which is, as photography's been easier to reproduce, less expensive, easier to transmit, easier for photographers to edit themselves, and as photographers have become more aware of the desire to kind of go deep into this explanatory project, documentary project, we have less and less and less photo essay space out there to publish in. And it's baffling to me. It's a shame. And it's great to see when you start to actually get those two forms working together well.
Ben, how important was the narrative to your picture of the woman voting in Liberia?
Well, I think that adding that narrative was important to that particular image, but not any more than the narrative was to all of these images. And that's really what I was trying to capture as the collator, really, and the editor here, is bringing together all of these stories and the different layers, really. And there's a layered understanding that sometimes is implied, sometimes it's obvious, other times it's not. And you want to get that individual voice of the photographer of what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, and their interpretation, both of these admittedly very broad categories of liberty and justice, intentionally broad so that the photographers can grapple with those large themes and try to understand how they feel about them. What do they mean to that individual? So the words are very important because it's their literary voice on the page as well, and that complements their visual voice in a way that I think is really powerful here. For me, I chose that particular image not necessarily on the strength of the photograph per se, but for the story it tells, which is a bit more of a complicated one. I have an image of a woman voting in Liberia's first truly free and fair election. And I wanted to also raise some issues that simply an election alone was not necessarily enough to think that everything is okay, right? There's a tendency to do that, so I was raising some questions there. But it's more about trying to get that layered voice. And so I'm so excited that all of the photographers really embraced that idea. And that's what we have here.
Can I just say, David, I just said the word layer is exactly what I felt, because when I first looked through, I looked only at the images. And, John Moore's image does not need an explanation. You know what's happening there. You know deep in your heart, and you feel it on one level. And then I guess it's almost like a bonus. When you read the narrative, you get so much more of the story, and you feel different things. So it just enhances it.
But Martha, you're doing similar things with different techniques. You're trying to communicate something. What is it? What is it you do, and why do you do it?
Well, I think that's just a simple question. We'll give you 10. I'm in TV. I can put anything down. I can get anything down to a minute and a half. So don't worry. You won't be here all night.
That's what you do, but why do you do it?
I think it's a great question. I think that's evolved.
Get to commercial.
Back to you, David. The
advantages of TV. This is a whole different thing.
We're so glib. I think why I do it has evolved. I think in a lot of ways, perhaps all of us found ourselves in places we never imagined we would be. And whatever that disciplined curiosity is that took us there evolved into something else. For me, covering the wars did become, I wanted to convey human feelings. I wanted to convey not, here's a tank, here's this, here's a front line, cover it like a Pentagon reporter or a White House reporter or anything. I wanted to feel it, and I wanted people to feel what the subjects were going through. It is, when I put a story together in a minute and a half or 2 minutes, or if it's a nightline, it can be a half an hour, I just want people to be there. And I think that's the simplest way I can say also what photojournalism is, or writing. You want people to feel it. I actually got roped into, which I've actually loved, teaching a class at Wesleyan this semester. And all my friends kept saying, well, it's kind of easy, right? You just talk about yourself. I said, yeah, that lasts about an hour, and then the other 40 hours, you actually have to put in some work. So I thought a lot about that question and what I wanted to convey to these students, and it really was, for me, and everybody else brings something else to this profession, for me, I want people to experience what my subjects are experiencing, what people are experiencing. And I'm proud of that. I think, you know, a lot of people say, oh, you should be objective. And I always say, I cannot be objective about sacrifice and service. So when I cover the war, I'm objective about certain things. And if bad things happen and if people mess up, it's one thing. But in terms of sacrifice and service, I want, like John did in that photograph, people to feel what that is like and to know they're other human beings.
John, she used the word evolve. When did you, at some point, go from your early days picking up a camera and taking a picture, from, gee, that's a nice picture, to what you have become as a communicator with some goal that you want to accomplish with your camera? What happened? What was the process?
Well, I guess I started in high school. I took a Photo 1 course as a junior in high school because I thought it would be fun and easy. Exactly those reasons. And it was both those things, and I still enjoy it, although it's not always easy anymore. What are the goals? You know, I think anymore, if you do this for a while, you know, I've met people on this stage in different places. You know, Martha in Pakistan. Philip and I have very close common friends working the same story, but not at the same time. Anymore, if you do this for a while, you do it partly because you want to tell the hard story, if you can. You try to, and sometimes it's conflict, but it's not always conflict. We don't. You can't do conflict all the time your whole career and still sit up on the stage. You do it as part of your work. But normally when we do what we really care about, it's because it's a tough story, and in my case, it's domestic here sometimes, and sometimes it's still abroad. But it's kind of a test to see if you can get into a place where others may not have gotten into, and sometimes, you know, sometimes we fail at that, but that's the goal.
Philip, back to the goal question to you. How did you, from early days of writing, and obviously you're a wonderful writer early on, what was the process for you to get to the point where you're communicating significant perspective, significant values to people to help us understand? What's the process?
I don't know that it's ever all that conscious it's not like I sit out and I'm like, I'm going to go try to communicate this or that to anybody. I tend to approach stories because I don't understand them. That's what draws me to things. And I'm not a conflict reporter. I am an aftermath reporter. I do not really, for the kind of stuff that I like to do, first of all, I'm not that interested in the moment of extreme violence and actually observing it or being around it. I'm not averse to it in principle, but it doesn't really feed me. It kind of is what it is, and I feel like there are other people who, and even maybe other media, including photography, that are better at the instant. What interests me is the moment when people are actually able to stand still long enough and not be freaking out about which way they should be moving or what to do to take care of themselves, to actually describe it and to start to see how people establish meaning about things that have happened, and the intersection of very private lives with really big public and historical events. And I started out writing fiction. It didn't occur to me there was anything else to write, that one could be a writer, and that would be nonfiction. It's a relatively recent concept, actually. In America, it wasn't taught in college when I was there. There were things that were good books that were taught in literature courses that were nonfiction, or claimed to be, like Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which claims to be. And you know, there were all sorts of things like that, but the idea of being a writer, and then I started to report, and I found that to be interesting as its own end and as its own activity. And to me, it's about very close observation. It's about going into things that I don't understand. If I really have my mind made up about something, I might write a comment, I might write an op-ed. If I have a real polemical impulse, then I'll try and find a polemical form. But for reporting seems to me to be something where you want to go in and start confused and get more confused pretty quickly. Be open to being confused, you know, and then you want to stay there while your head gets turned around a few different times, and you kind of come back on your original thought and then bang off it again. And you know, you don't quite know what it is you're looking for. You need to hear people, and you need to be surprised by people, and you need to be quite prepared to find out that the people you thought you sympathized with. Certainly in Rwanda, this happened to me with, in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, with the whole humanitarian organizations. I went in there assuming these guys were basically the closest thing to my guys there were, and I came out with very few of them thinking that way about me, certainly, and except for a few friends. And you know, I've come to feel at times also very critical of the sort of presumption that the human rights organizations actually are good at analyzing political situations. They're averse to it. They're hostile to politics. They are superior to politics. They have sort of taken over a lot of journalistic perspectives that I'm very worried about that. They're a critically important perspective on the world, but they want us to think they are the only one. It's an orthodoxy. So I'm worried about orthodoxies. And I think that as a reporter, our job is just to kind of keep looking and looking very closely. And this is where I keep coming back to photojournalism. I had the great good fortune when I first got some writing assignments where photojournalists were sent along to work with some of the real greats. My first time working with a photojournalist was on an assignment for Outside Magazine in Cambodia, and they gave me Philip Jones Griffiths to work with. And I was like, you know, I'm here to write the captions. And he said, no, because you got an assignment as a writer, I get to take a picture, you know? And I realized how mixed up this was. Here's somebody who'd spent much of his life in exactly that part of the world, and who knew what he was looking at, and who looked at it, and who was very serious about trying to take pictures that didn't necessarily need words beyond them. He knew a lot, and if you stood and talked to him about anything, there was a lot there. Some of it made perfect sense even. Some of it did not. But working with people who really are looking, they're listening too, but it's just whatever's in front of them. They can't change that because they had an opinion to start with.
Phil, you mentioned the word violence, the dangers of all of this, which has to be asked, and obviously it's a key component to this whole conversation about photojournalists and journalists working in harm's way, which they do every day, as we know. I remember asking Eddie Adams one time how he dealt with it, and he was talking about his Vietnam experiences, and he says, well, when I'm looking through my eyepiece, he said, I feel bulletproof. And he said, of course, when I put the camera down, I realize I'm not. And by the way, Eddie's widow, Alyssa, is here, and it's wonderful that Alyssa came to join us tonight. But back to the question. Martha and John especially, you deal with this and have dealt with it for years of putting yourself in harm's way. So how do you deal with it, and what do you deal with it?
Denial is a great thing. I want to say that I think photojournalists, first of all, are way more in the front lines than me. And I remember Peter Jennings talking about the fact that he did not want his photographer to go any place that he wouldn't go. I feel the same way, but you go places that, you know, you're going to outrun me, you're going to do all that. You need that moment. And people ask me that a lot, as you may expect, and I probably give the same answer a lot. I don't don't think about it a lot, and I don't think you can, or you might stop. And I think the lens that you look through and the journalistic lens that you look through and you feel a little bulletproof, that works with me too. And when my colleague Bob Woodruff was very badly injured, I was the one at ABC who was reporting on that. And I remember at the end of that week, because I went in and I immediately was on the air and I was talking about it, and ABC sort of put me out as the person to talk about Bob, who was a dear friend. And at the end of that week, that lens broke down, but that was very personal. I have had experiences over the years where the lens cracks, where I have seen things that profoundly affect me. But it doesn't happen very often, or I don't think you keep going back.
John? Yeah. Ben? Yeah.
Simply because Philip is going to need to leave pretty soon, I'd like to ask him one more question.
Okay, go.
Before he goes, and then we can continue talking.
Right.
I want to respect his time. I'm sorry. But
No,
it's great that you're here. So, what I'm wondering is, just as some parting thoughts. Also, you talked about the way that both, reporting is changing, I think, in a way, right? We're talking about how more people have been injured or killed recently than before. And also, the media itself is changing with outlets, et cetera. It's becoming harder, I think, to report some stories and others. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on how the landscape is changing overall and how you see it going forward, and if there's a particular way that can still communicate visually. How are you thinking about these ideas?
I'm not a great theorist on like where the media is going, because I guess I feel like there are two ways that you can go about what we're doing, and one is to spend your time thinking about where it's going, and the other is trying to tell the stories that you want to tell as best you can with whatever there is there. And I'd rather spend my time, and maybe I'm lucky that I get to spend a fair amount of my time trying to push that other stuff to the side and say, well, right now they seem to still want a magazine piece, and like maybe I can write another book before that stops existing, and or anyway, you stop getting paid for it, or something, and you just, because like, what good is it for me to think about that? And what I do have total confidence is that we will continue to have media in one form or another. There will be a new medium that will replace the old. People are not going to cease to be interested in having stories, reporting, news, images, voices, all of this. And they are going to have to figure out ways to pay for it, because they will not get it in any decent quality if they are simply going on everybody with their cell phone. And that said, everybody with their cell phone's a hugely interesting addition to this picture. To the situation we're in, and it's complicating, confusing. It's also potentially very valuable to us to work with it and to try to figure out how to work with it as a journalist. I mean, I wrote about Abu Ghraib, and as far as I'm concerned, one of the things that was really interesting about the story of Abu Ghraib is that it's the first time where the defining images were taken by participants. And the story itself exists only because the participants took the image. And the complication of what their motives were and what they thought they were doing taking those images and being in those images is extremely interesting and important, because that war, the Iraq war, if you go back and like go through newspaper advertising, from photo stores and things like that, and you look at those full-page B&H ads or something from like 2002, that's when the cheap portable camera, digital camera arrived, 2001, 2002. Everybody went to war suddenly with a camera that they could share the photos immediately with everybody on Earth and with one another. And they traded photographs, and they took photographs, and they traded photographs. And they also belonged to this new generation where like privacy didn't exist, right? And all images are equal, right? So you just kind of like flip through there, and there's like, oh, look, a butterfly, like kitty cat, naked person raping somebody, cool, dead person, whoa, like my grandmother's birthday, And it's like all whatever, right? And then the guy sitting next to you is like, that's cool, can you send that to me? And boing, right? And it's just sensational, right? And in the process of doing this Abu Ghraib stuff, I started to see some of the photo, like, caches of some of these soldiers. And just these amazing combat photographs that are in there, just gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes of stuff that they're taking and that they're seeing that you can't see. Even if you're the most embedded photographer, you're never going to see it from the spot that they're in. So it's valuable. It's interesting. It's not journalism exactly. It's not memoir. It's not conscious. But it's not unconscious. It's not conscious at the level that we think of as deliberate image makers. But it might be the most important images of our time at any moment. And it may tell us something. I mean, I think of the Abu Ghraib photographers as the most vilified public servants of our time. They did a huge public service, right? They showed us what we might have thought we knew was probably happening. But they showed us pictures of American policy in action at this incredible level, and they were immediately sent to jail. The only people who went to jail for war crimes in Iraq, basically, or for those crimes in Iraq, were photographers. Remember that. They went for taking the pictures and being in the pictures. The photographs were the crime. And that's pretty interesting. If you stop and think about the fact that the photographs were the crime. And even Donald Rumsfeld said, like, they're taking these illegal photographs, you know? It was like, no, they're taking photographs of these illegal things that people are like doing because they're under orders and they're sanctioned and they're permitted and they're licensed and they're allowed. But the photographs became the crime. And even if you talk to the forensic investigators within the CID, you know, in the military, what are they looking at? They're looking at what's in the photograph. If it's outside the frame, forget it, who cares, right? It's like not a crime.
I was just going to say, one of the things that was really interesting to me about Abu Ghraib was Rumsfeld, as you said, who, to him, photographs were those packs of photos that would go away in the Kodak envelope. And I think that's part of the reason he never thought anything would happen, is that he thought there were just these prints of these photos and no one would ever see them. He didn't
They freaked
get
out.
the
They
digital
suddenly
thing.
realized they actually sent CID investigators to homes, like Sabrina Harmon, who was one of the photographer MPs, and who had actually wanted to be a forensic photographer for the police force in her real life. Pretty interesting person. And who had a very large appetite, probably equal to anybody in this room, for looking at cadavers and things. She, her girlfriend, her wife back home, had a visit from CID investigators in like suburban Virginia who wanted to see her computer hard drive. And so they were trying actually to see if they could contain the viral spread of the Abu Ghraib photographs. And the whole, you know, those guys were all sitting in like jail for months before they prosecuted. And before the New Yorker and CBS broke this story, Cy Hirsch and 60 Minutes broke this story, there was still this question like, if we could suppress the story, maybe we don't have to prosecute it, right? Like, what's worse? If we prosecute this story, it comes out. If we don't, so photographs by participants, that seems really interesting. That's not really exactly what you were asking about. It's not going to tell you. I'm not suggesting that you all enlist and become torturers and take pictures of it, but there are a lot of things that are happening, and people are recording things differently. Even in Rwanda, I find that people are much more media conscious now in complicated and interesting ways. They have phones, and they talk to their phones. They use recordings in their phones. They use all these devices. There's information that's being collected by all sorts of people who can actually offer it to you as somebody who's trying to put it all together. That is very interesting. So I don't think of all this stuff as the enemy merely, but it is. We're in a transitional period, and the press, the storytelling business, has always been driven by technology, or been shaped in its moment by the technology of its time. You know, I don't think Shakespeare would be writing plays for Stratford right now, and he'd be doing something else. And you know, the people who wrote rock and roll protest songs in the '60s aren't going to be doing that now. They're going to be doing something else with it. You know, there's different moments where there's a set of media that work for you, and then their storytellers are always going to be there.
Philip, I know you have to go, but one quick question. Thinking about this is a literary journal, and yet here are photographs being a bulk of this. How unusual is this, and how useful is it?
I don't think it's that unusual. Literary magazines and magazines in general have often been the best friends that photojournalists have outside of full-paying, you know, this frame, that frame news photography. And I think that the mutual recognition of a storytelling exercise and of a documentary exercise and of an attempt to sort of convey a mixture of emotion and image and situation. And I think really one of the things that the best photojournalism to me can do is to kind of complicate the whole question of insider and outsider. You know, as a journalist in a foreign place, certainly, or in any story that's not your own personal story, you're always a little bit the outsider, asking questions, looking this way, and so forth. And the photographer does that really like bluntly. There's this thing between their face and the people they're looking at, right? They're like blocked off, which makes it easier to look, and because you're not being seen quite as much. But you get to actually look at the way that people represent themselves much more directly. So really great photojournalism often sort of conveys the pageantry. I mean, I think Tim Hetherington's photographs of Liberia are a great example of this. Some of Gilles Paris's work in Ireland and other places, you know, where you really start to enter into like how a funeral looks, how they play out the drama of their own historical moment and their own thing. It's not like they're all victims or all perpetrators or something like that. They're involved in a historical event, and it has its forms, and photographs can really capture that. And I think literary magazines are one of the refuges that this can come to now. You know, basically in commercial magazines, it's very, very rare to see more than a single photograph illustrating a story, and that's a shame. But you know, between that and the web, there are these magazines, and they allow you to settle in, they allow you to do 10, 12, 15 pages. They allow a text to work alongside it in an interesting way. They create that time and space that's essential. And speaking of time and space, I really apologize for having to leave.
Come back to the question I asked Martha, if you would, about danger. Is there some point at which you say, can't do this anymore?
Well,
because of what you've seen?
No, if you go to conflict zones over the years, you learn ways to try and stay as safe as you can. I'm often on, over the last 10 years, I've spent a lot of time embedded with U.S. soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. I spent a fair amount of time in the Middle East and Africa. There's many pictures that I simply couldn't make. There are times when I could see the picture way over there, and I couldn't shoot it, and a lot of the people I respect in the business couldn't shoot it either, and you really just have to gauge it. You know, in the case of Chris and Tim, they were doing exactly what many of us, if not most of us in the business, would have been doing at that exact moment. They were on the front lines, and they were not doing anything any riskier than many of us do as part of our work. They'd been doing it for many years. They were the smartest in the business. Things like that happen, even to the smartest guys in the room. And I think what was most surprising to and shocking and heartbreaking to many of us in the business, aside from being close to them, being friends, respecting work, all that comes with that, is that it hadn't happened for many of us to people we knew very closely. The U.S. and Europe, for that matter, certainly the UK, had been spared a huge number of deaths in the last 10 years. We've lost lots of colleagues, Iraqi colleagues, Afghan colleagues, Algerian colleagues, but we hadn't, in my case, I hadn't lost a bunch of my own colleagues, and so it shook me and it shook a lot of us. And as we've seen in the last year, it's been repeated. It's, you know, part of the difficulty of the beauty and the beast of working in a revolution like Libya. And Chris, he came in for Getty after I was there. The beast of it is that you have full access, you have total access. Unlike with the U.S. military that keeps you back in some ways. In Libya, there was no one to keep you back. And we covered that story accordingly, and I think journalists in Syria have covered that story as well. you do it because you can, and most of us come out just fine, but not always.
Martha, compared to 15 or 20 years ago, are you all able to tell the stories that you want to tell more easily? Do you have more access than you might have had 15 or 20 years ago, or certainly in maybe Vietnam?
Well, I think in some ways, I mean, particularly in Iraq, I mean, there were periods there where it was so dangerous. There were places you absolutely couldn't go. There were stories you
most of the country.
absolutely, yeah, most of the country you absolutely couldn't tell. So it wasn't that we were restricted. It was just that, you know, you would die. And it's like John. I mean, you really do. You can be in his denial as much as you want, but you certainly have to have rules for yourself or your own what you're willing to risk. And it comes a point where it's stupid at some point. So, and particularly in, you know, from 2005, I guess, to 2007, in Iraq, there were places you absolutely couldn't go. I mean, the military would try to help, and you could go with the military and pretend that that was safer. I remember telling my son at one point that, you know, I take as many, you know, I'm as safe as I possibly can be, and I always go with the military. And he looked at me, and he was, you know, about 14 at the time. He said, "Mom, those are the people they're targeting." Like, okay, all right, that didn't work. I'll try another approach. But so I think access, you know, in Vietnam, you know, they did the same thing. They went out with the military. But I think what people forget in particular in Iraq and Afghanistan now, more and more, everything is a front line. And I think in Vietnam, the battles were probably, soldiers would go out and be in firefights probably every 60 or 90 days, and then they got a break. In this, everywhere you went in Iraq, you were in danger. And I think that's why the country's going to see an explosion of post-traumatic stress syndrome, disorder, or whatever we want to call that. And I know they're trying to drop the D in that. That there was that fight or flee all the time. And I think we felt that too. You know, you didn't go back to the forward operating bases at night and think, oh, I'm back, everything's fine, because there are rockets coming in. So it was a really different kind of fight. I mean, the same horrendous battles in Vietnam, but this was with roadside bombs everywhere. There was no front line.
And you know, people talk about, well, you know, did you get into, soldiers were like, you know, we had this tick. A tick is a, you know,
Troops in contact.
Exactly, a firefight.
I'm so good at acronyms.
And it's not actually in places like in wars like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not so much the fighting that you worry about. It's just simply driving down the road. I was rarely worried about going on an operation, going on a military operation, and getting hurt, because when all the helicopters swoop in, and they've got air support, they've got a bunch of troops. These guys are safer than when they're just driving down the road, on going from one place to another. It's being inside that vehicle that you worry about, and that's and as you said, Martha, it's like a total anxiety 24/7 when you're in vehicles that are millions of dollars each, and they're not going to stop it. And so it's a very different type of anxiety working in those situations.
How many close calls do you have where something happened nearby and you thought, wow, if I was 4 steps away, I wouldn't be here? Did you have any experiences like that made you think twice?
No, I never had those.
We never think twice. I mean, why bother? Once is enough. I had one that I remember, and I never thought about it again. I did the same thing. It's ridiculous to think about that. It's ridiculous to say, oh, you know, if I was there instead of there. But I was out with Marines once on a patrol, and it was a foot patrol, which is, you would think, more dangerous. And the platoon leader said, do you want to take the Humvee back? And it wasn't very far away. It was probably about 200 yards away. And I said, no, I'm going to stay with you guys. I'm going to walk the foot patrol. In my mind, I thought, oh my gosh, my husband would kill me if he heard me say that. But I was very committed to staying with these Marines. I'd been with them all day. And we started walking back, and a rocket went right over our head and hit right next to the Humvee I would have been in. And that's when I thought, you really can't. You can't do that math. You just can't say if I was there. Well, if I was there, maybe the Humvee would have, been slower. Maybe it would have been, so you just can't do it.
Yeah, to answer your question, seriously, David, of course, because I've been doing this for a while, there's been some incidences. I guess the most well-known would have been when Benazir Bhutto was killed, because I was quite close, about 20 yards, and so that does happen. Looking at the digital time code on my camera, 10 seconds before I was 4 yards from her vehicle, and then when it blew up, I was 20 yards away. I had a sense I didn't feel right about something. I moved away. All of us who do this and cover conflict over a period of time will have different stories. And the real question is, we'll never have an answer. Those of us who do this, how often does it happen that we have no clue about? Thankfully, normally we don't know when there's close calls. I think they happen frequently. They happen in normal life, and they certainly happen covering conflict where we go about our business and we have no idea what that person 30 yards that way was thinking.
Can I just say, I'm thinking back to when Bob Woodruff was hurt, and when he was going over to Iraq on that trip, I was trying to help him set up an embed and was trying to get him an embed with Marines. And it was on track, and then as it happened, the Marines were changing out command and another group was coming in, so the general who I was dealing with there said, I'm really sorry, we can't take Bob because we're going, and afterwards I thought, oh, if he'd been with the Marines, but then he wouldn't have been hurt, and he ended up with the Army, but I thought, or maybe he would have been killed. I mean, you instead of badly injured and the great guy he is today, but yeah, you just can't do that.
If the phone rings tomorrow, will you go back to Afghanistan? If the phone rings tomorrow, will you go for Getty back to Afghanistan?
I am.
Yeah, of course.
It's already rung, David.
Of course.
Martha Raddatz, John Moore, editor Ben Spatz, thank you all very much.
The idea of freedom, of liberty, of justice, I mean, it is all about what we try to do. I think we try to seek truth. I don't know that we always find it. I tell people that, everybody thinks journalists can go find the truth. Truth is complicated. Truth is confusing. Truth is messy sometimes. But what you try to find is what people's lives are like, sharing with the rest of the world. To me, it opens up the world to people. If you look at these amazing photographs around here, and you read the narrative in those photographs, you've just opened the world to yourself. You've just learned. I learned. I learned looking through these pictures and said, oh my goodness, that's there. I haven't been to all these places. So I think it's such a learning experience about liberty, about justice, about freedom. Everyone defines that differently. I might define freedom in a certain way, and I have freedom. Others might define it in a much smaller way, but to them what they have is important.